The sound did not enter through my ears, it arrived through my marrow, a jagged vibrating frequency that tasted of salt and ionized silver. In the scorched expanse of the Texas desert, silence had always been the commander of the dunes, but on this night in 1919, the silence was murdered by a transmission from a star that shouldn't have a voice. My name is Leo Finch, and I spent the Great War as a telegrapher in the mud of France, listening to the rhythmic clicking of death. I thought I knew every sound a wire could make. I was wrong. At Fort Bliss, tucked against the jagged shadow of the Franklin Mountains, we intercepted something that wasn't code. It was a command to rewrite the physical laws of our world, a signal that turned the very air into a weapon and the soldiers into hollow shells of static. I was sitting in the listening post Delta, a shack of corrugated iron and sun-bleached timber, when the vacuum tubes began to scream. Not a hum, not a whistle, a scream. The glass of the tubes turned a violent, bruised purple, and the copper wires began to glow with a heat that didn't burn the skin but vibrated the soul. Buck, get the lieutenant. The lattice is bleeding. I roared over the rising cacophony. Sergeant Barrett Buck Cannon kicked the door open, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He was a man built of granite and scars, clutching a bar that looked like an extension of his own arms. He looked out the window at the 300-foot radio tower we had built to coordinate the coastal defenses. The steel lattice was no longer just metal. It was being consumed by a geometric fungus of obsidian glass that grew in rhythmic pulses, following the beat of the signal. It ain't just the tower, Leo, Buck grunted, his voice a low rumble. Look at the dunes. I looked. The sand wasn't shifting with the wind, it was vibrating into perfect, terrifying mathematical patterns. And from those patterns they rose. We called them signal wraiths, translucent, flickering silhouettes of light that looked like soldiers made of television static, decades before the world would even know what television was. They moved with a nonlinear glitch, appearing 10 feet away, then 5, then right at the perimeter wire in the blink of an eye. Fix bayonets. Activate the voltage packs. Lieutenant Clara Dalton burst into the yard, her uniform dusty but her eyes like flint. Behind her, a squad of signal breakers carried the experimental technology we had been testing, bulky backpacks filled with buzzing copper coils and glowing vacuum tubes designed to project a localized interference field. They were our only shield against the wraiths. The first wraith hit the perimeter. It didn't climb the wire, it simply phased through the metal, the steel turning to brittle glass and shattering as the entity passed. It let out a sound, a high-frequency burst of white noise that made the ears of the nearest sentry explode in a spray of blood. The man fell, his body instantly covered in the same obsidian crystalline growth that was eating the radio tower. Open fire. Give them the lead. The defense of Fort Bliss turned into a chaotic strobe light of violence. Buck opened up with his bar, the .30-06 rounds tearing through the air. But the wraiths were ghosts of data. The bullets passed through them, leaving ripples in the static but doing no physical damage. Aim for the ground anchors. The signal is coming from the earth. Dalton screamed, her Colt 1911 barking as she fired at a group of biomechanical spiders, small multi-legged machines made of brass and pulsing violet light that were scuttling out of the crystalline dunes. I grabbed my own rifle, but the signal was inside my head now. Every time the radio tower pulsed, my vision glitched. I saw the desert as it was, then as a sea of black glass, then as a void of infinite white. I stumbled out of the listening post, the heat of the desert air mixing with the freezing cold of the alien frequency. Leo, get to the transmitter. We have to reverse the polarity or this signal is going to reach the relay in DC. Ada Thorne, our lead technician, grabbed my arm. She was wearing a heavy leather apron and goggles, her hands covered in the sapphire ichor of a dead spider machine. We sprinted across the yard, ducking as a heat beam from the tower lanced over our heads, vaporizing a water tank and turning the air into a wall of scalding steam. The signal breakers were holding the line, their voltage packs creating a blue-white dome of electrical interference that forced the wraiths to stay physical. When the wraiths became solid, our bullets finally found purchase. I watched a wraith shatter like a dropped mirror under a volley of Springfield fire, its static dissolving into the sand. But the spiders were the real threat. Hundreds of them were swarming the base of the tower, their brass legs clicking as they built more of the obsidian lattice. They weren't just soldiers, they were construction crews, turning our base into a giant antenna for a deeper, darker invasion. Buck, cover the stairs. Buck stood at the base of the radio tower, a mountain of defiance. He planted his feet and let the bar roar, the continuous fire mowing down the spiders as they tried to climb the steel legs. The barrel of his gun turned a dull cherry red, the heat shimmering in the twilight. "I've got the stairs. Get that box workin', Ada?" Ada and I climbed the interior ladder of the tower. The higher we went, the louder the signal became. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was a physical weight. The obsidian crystals were growing around the rungs, their sharp edges cutting into my palms. I could feel the signal trying to format my memories, trying to replace the image of my mother with a sequence of prime numbers. "Don't listen to it, Leo. Focus on the copper. Focus on the coil," Ada yelled, her voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. We reached the primary transmitter deck, 100 feet above the desert floor. The view was a nightmare. From this height I could see the desert for miles. There were hundreds of these obsidian towers rising from the sand all across the Texas border, all of them pulsing in synchronization. We weren't just an outpost under attack, we were the ground zero of a planetary takeover. The relay is slave to the central core. I need to jam the frequency manually. Ada opened the main control panel. Inside, the wires had been replaced by glowing violet filaments that throbbed like veins. She reached in with a pair of insulated pliers, but the signal lashed out. A bolt of violet lightning threw her back against the railing, her goggles shattering. "Ada. I'm okay. I'm glitched, Leo. My arm. I can't feel my arm." I looked at her. Her right arm was translucent, flickering like the wraiths. The signal was consuming her. "Tell me what to do." I grabbed the pliers. The 3 brass knobs. Turn them counterclockwise until the vacuum tubes turn orange. Then, the big lever. It'll blow the capacitors and the whole tower with it. You won't have time to get down. I looked down at the courtyard. Lieutenant Dalton and the survivors were being pushed back into the barracks. The signal breakers' packs were dying, the blue domes flickering and failing. The wraiths were closing in, their static screams drowning out the sound of the gunfire. Buck was still at the base, firing his last magazine into a wall of spiders, his face set in a grim mask of duty. I didn't think about the fall. I didn't think about the fire. I thought about the silence of the desert I used to love. I turned the first knob. The violet light dimmed. I turned the second. The thrumming in my marrow changed to a low, mournful hum. I turned the third, and the vacuum tubes erupted in a beautiful human orange glow. The tower groaned. The obsidian crystals began to crack, the alien geometry unable to handle the sudden shift in frequency. The red lens at the top of the tower, the eye of the signal, shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Buck, Dalton, get clear." I screamed, though I knew they couldn't hear me. I looked at Ada. She was almost entirely static now, a beautiful, flickering ghost of the woman she had been. She smiled at me, a soundless movement of her lips. I grabbed the big lever. "For Texas," I whispered. I pulled. The explosion wasn't orange. It was a blinding, pure white flash that started at the transmitter and traveled down the lattice like a lightning strike in reverse. The capacitors detonated with the force of 1,000 artillery shells. The steel of the tower vaporized, the obsidian crystals turning into a fine, harmless black dust that the wind immediately carried away. The shockwave flattened the barracks and sent the wraiths into a final, violent dissolution. As the signal died, the entity simply vanished, their static fading into the cold night air. The spiders stopped moving, their brass shells becoming inert lumps of metal in the sand. I felt the platform vanish beneath me. I felt the rush of the air and the heat of the white fire. But for the first time in hours it was quiet. The signal was gone. My mind was my own again. I saw the stars above the Franklin Mountains, and they were just stars, silent, distant, and beautiful. I hit the sand, the darkness swallowing the world before the pain could even arrive. Hours later, the sun began to rise over Fort Bliss. The radio tower was a stump of blackened, twisted metal, a tombstone for a war the world would never read about in the history books. Lieutenant Dalton sat in the ruins of the courtyard, her face covered in soot, watching the signal breakers dismantle their burnt-out packs. Buck Cannon was leaning against a shattered water tank, his bar across his lap, smoking a cigarette with hands that didn't shake. There were no more towers on the horizon. The obsidian had turned to dust, and the dunes were just sand again, shifting naturally with the morning breeze. The signal had been severed, the bridge between the worlds burnt to a cinder by a few men and women who refused to be formatted. The silence of Texas returned, heavy and honest. The desert didn't care about the star-spawned voices, and it didn't care about the metal we left behind. It only cared about the wind. The tubes are dark. The copper is cold. The desert is silent. The sun climbs higher, illuminating the scars on the earth, but the air is clear. We are the listeners who stopped the noise, the ghosts who stayed in the meat. The transmission is over, and the world remains ours to define in the quiet of the dawn. The dunes hold their secrets and the radio stays dead. We walk away from the ruin, our boots heavy in the sand, and we do not look back at the mountains. The sky is empty, and for now that is enough. The obsidian is dust. The static is gone. The tower is a memory,